I'm here to read a couple more chapters from Twitches. When we left off, Mr. Twit had kind of played around with Mrs. Twit's cane. So, this chapter is called Mrs. Twit Has the Shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are. You're sitting in your old chair. You've shrunk so your feet haven't touched the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. There she is, not touching the ground in her chair. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night when he had gone downstairs to stuck a little bit extra onto the stick, and he had done the same to the four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair," he cried. "You've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms and the spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens? Your head shrinks into your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end, there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "I can't bear it," cried Mrs. Twit. "It's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit. "The worst in the world." How long have I got it?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up a bundle of old clothes and pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. "At the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head sadly, "I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. "But isn't there anything we can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "There's only one cure for shrinks," cried Mr. Twit. "Tell me," she cried. "Tell me quickly." "We'll have to hurry," said Mr. Twit. "You ready?" I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say," cried Mrs. Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," said Mr. Twit, giving another grisly grin. "What is it I must do?" cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. "You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit. So there's Mrs. Twit sitting in the chair, freaking out. Okay, Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. That's the next chapter. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors where he had everything ready to get great stretching. He had 100 balloons, lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. He had fixed an iron ring into the ground. "Stand here," he said, pointing to the iron ring. He then tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on the long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled on its string, trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the string to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied around her neck, some under her arms, and some to her wrists, and some even to her hair. Soon there were 50 colored balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" asked Mr. Twit. I can," cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull began very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now. With her feet tied to the ground, her arms pulled upward by the balloons, she was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. So here she is, stretching out. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit the second nasty idea. I'll read the next chapter too, okay? Here we go. Mrs. Twit goes ballooning up. "There was enough pull to take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried out. To take you to the moon, exclaimed Mr. Twit. What a ghastly thought. We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh, dear me, no. The most certainly wouldn't, cried Mrs. Twit. Put some more settings around the ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe. Very well, my angel, Mr. Twit said, and with a ghoulish grin on his lips, he knelt down to his feet. He took a knife from his pocket with one quick slash, and he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. Help! She screamed. Save me! But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds, she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below, looking up. What a pretty sight, he said to himself. How lovely all those balloons look in the sky, and that was a marvelous bit of luck for me. At least the old hag is lost and gone forever. So I'm going to leave on a cliffhanger, and we'll read more on Monday. All right, guys, have a good day.